We're back.
Yep.
You're rolling.
Uh-huh.
How do I look?
You look all right.
Okay, fine. Okay, so here are two accurate statements about the big news of the week. First, the government is about to shut down. Second, Republicans are about to shut down the government. Both of those are true statements, but they're not equivalent. The first one has this sort of passive construction to it, right? The government is about to shut down, but who's shutting it down? It kind of makes it sound like the government will stop functioning all on its own. The second one provides news consumers with really important information. It makes clear for them who is responsible for the fact that the government is about to shut down so that they can factor it into their civic actions. Like maybe they want to call their senators or members of Congress. Maybe they aren't sure who to vote for, but this might help them decide. So real quick, let's cut to the good news. If the government shuts down at the end of the week, I do think most Americans will know Republicans, and particularly House Republicans, are the reason why. Even if the mainstream news botches the story on almost every level, it'll be hard for Republicans to escape accountability for what's about to happen. And there are interesting civics-based reasons for that, which I want to get to in a minute. But even with Republican fingerprints all over a potential shutdown, our most prominent journalists at our most prominent news desks feel encumbered from saying so. Take this example from the New York Times, for instance. The print edition headline read, "Congress falters as shutdown looms." The online version was a little spicier. It said, "Facing a shutdown, Congress melts down." And the subheadline actually cut pretty close to the chase. It said, "Bands of Republicans in the House and Senate have brought the spending debate to a screeching halt, with a shutdown just days away." But the piece just struggles to come out and say what's actually happening. And what's actually happening is that House Republicans have collapsed into a kind of civil war. There's a band of far-right Republicans in the House who believe that their toehold of power in one half of Congress entitles them to dictate the terms of how the government should be run and how much we should spend on which government functions. And the Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, has ceded a bunch of power to them. There's a few reasons for that. One is that Donald Trump wants Republicans to shut down the government. The right-wing members of the House GOP take their cues from Trump, and the party as a whole typically does what he says. Another is that those House Republicans have threatened to end McCarthy's speakership if he cuts a deal across the aisle with Democrats to fund the government in a consensus, bipartisan manner. So annual funding for the government includes military spending and a bunch of non-defense spending, and all of that expires on September 30th. And McCarthy and the House Republicans just seem poised to let that happen. They haven't passed a bill to avert it, and they aren't negotiating with Democrats on something that could get votes from both parties to avert the shutdown. The rest of the government, that's President Biden, House Democrats, Senate Democrats, even many Senate Republicans, they're good to go. They'd stand ready to enact a full-year funding bill, or even just temporary legislation to make sure things continue running, right? So that the national parks don't close, so that Social Security offices stay open, and so on. It's just House Republicans. And all of official Washington knows it. Democrats, Republicans, the executive branch, the legislature, and the media. But that is not how most mainstream news chooses to report it. You get a lot of Congress can't get its act together. Congress fails to reach spending deal. Government shutdown looms. On Meet the Press this weekend, Kristen Welker said,
"I understand the fight is with the House, but again, if there's a shutdown, it falls on everyone's shoulders. There is some movement potentially in the Democratic-led Senate to try to reach a deal. Is President Biden doing anything? Why not use his bully pulpit more to try to avert this?"
And that kind of framing serves only one major purpose, and that is it spares the outlets and the journalists from presenting the news in a way that sounds partisan, right? Blaming Republicans and holding Democrats harmless does sound partisan. They don't want to do that, and they don't want to do that even though it's true and maybe the most important political fact about the shutdown. But like I said, I think most people will know where to apportion blame if a shutdown actually happens. And that's because, in part, not all the journalism about this is bad. Even some of the mealy-mouthed reporting will bury the fact that this all stems from GOP infighting and extreme GOP tactics. But there's a track record here too, and the track record suggests that the public has a pretty good idea of who's at fault for government shutdowns. Part of it is that it's basically always Republicans, and they generally do it when Democrats are in power. But at a basic functional level, it's just pretty easy to intuit who's responsible, just based on who's making a bunch of outrageous or non-germane demands. So the way annual government appropriations work is that funding for all these thousands of accounts expires at the end of the fiscal year. And with that hard deadline to provide motivation, Congress is supposed to decide whether to renew that funding and whether it should be adjusted upward or downward. So if one party charges into the negotiations over that and says, we demand huge cuts to Medicaid, we want to slash federal spending across the board by 10%, we demand banning abortion funding in Washington, D.C., we demand defunding the prosecutions of Donald Trump, and we won't vote to fund the government unless we get those things. Well, it's pretty easy to figure out who's the aggressor in that confrontation. Funny enough, Donald Trump actually defunded his own government for 35 days at the end of 2018. He refused to sign funding legislation unless Congress included funding for his hysterical border wall. Well, Democrats opposed it, and there weren't votes for a sort of rider to the funding bill that would have allowed him to build a border wall. So normally a president would say, fine, it's normal not to get everything you want in a big negotiation like that. So I'll just keep fighting for the stuff that I didn't get down the line. But Trump didn't do that. He just overturned the game board. He chose a shutdown thinking people would blame Democrats and that this would somehow force Democrats to bend to his demand. But they didn't. People realized who was making the extraneous demand. They blamed Republicans as usual because Republicans were to blame. And so Trump finally relented. And my hunch is that if the government shuts down this week, it'll go the way it usually goes. People will get mad at Republicans, and eventually Republicans will cave. But if that happens, it won't be because of the impeccable work of the legacy media. Is that decoded enough for you?
Yeah, I think so.
Amen.